Continuing right now in your Google Classroom, we're taking a look today at some more of the reform movements in the 1800s. And so, take a look at this image that you see here. I'm going to ask you to write down 5 things that you noticed about this image. Okay, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of imagery here. Okay, take a look. Take a look at what's going on. So I want you to write down 5 things that you noticed about this image. And then we will continue with the rest of the article today in a few moments. Okay, now back. And so let's take a look then at the caption. It says, as a police officer threw Elizabeth Jennings out into the street, white passengers watched in silence. So that's what was going on here. Maybe you noticed that. Maybe some of you wrote that down. Um, but that's what's going on. Who is Elizabeth Jennings in the first place? Well, this article, the civil rights hero you've never heard of. A century before Rosa Parks, a young black woman in New York City, refused to get off a whites only streetcar, striking an early blow for equal rights. And so this article came out a couple of years ago, and we're going to make sure that we know who Elizabeth Jennings is from here on out. It is a story that most Americans know by heart. In the city where black people suffer the daily insult of segregation, an African American woman stands up for herself. One day, she challenges the rules that separate blacks from whites on public transportation. Her act of resistance leads to changing those rules for good. Who was that woman? Well, most of us would think of Rosa Parks. In 1955, she refused to give up her bus seat to a white person in Montgomery, Alabama. Again, that was 1955. This led to a campaign to desegregate Montgomery's buses. It helped start the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. But this drama that we're talking about in this article took place in New York City 100 years before Parks' protest in 1854. Again, this is during the time of the reform movements. 27-year-old Elizabeth Jennings refused the conductor's command to get off a streetcar where white passengers were riding. After she was forced off that car, she sued the streetcar company and won. So she won her case. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this is not like the courtroom cases that we think of, or maybe you watch it on TV in modern times, where you would have a person in the courtroom called a stenographer, and that person is responsible for making sure that everything that happens in the courtroom is typed out word for word. The transcript gets printed, everybody gets a copy, and everybody knows what happened in the courtroom. That wasn't the case in the 1800s. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why. But the other part too is that 1854, there was a lot of stuff going on in the United States at that time, leading right up to the Civil War. Now, you may not have heard of Elizabeth Jennings, and yet her case was one that helped break the back of segregation in New York, says Amy Hill Harth, the author of a new book about Jennings called Streetcar to Justice. Jennings was, as historians say, one of the first civil rights heroes in American history. Now let's take a look then at this video, Fighting for Equality, a video about the civil rights movements in the United States.
This woman refused to give up her seat on a bus in Alabama. These 4 college students protested at an all-white lunch counter. These men and women marched with thousands of others in Washington, D.C. What do these people have in common? They were all part of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. During the civil rights movement, African Americans, along with white men and women, publicly protested for change. They were fighting for civil rights, the rights and freedoms that every U.S. citizen has under the Constitution. Civil rights include your right to go to school, get a job, live in a safe and secure home, and more. Although slavery was officially outlawed in the U.S. in 1865, African Americans continued to face cruel and unfair treatment long after that. Jim Crow laws were used to keep white and black people apart and to treat black people unfairly. One part of Jim Crow was segregation, the forced separation of people of different races. In many places, especially the South, African Americans were segregated or kept apart from white Americans. Black people were forced to attend separate schools, eat at separate restaurants, and use separate bathrooms. In many states, segregation was the law. In 1896, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation, ruled that it was legal to require African Americans to use separate facilities, such as bathrooms and restaurants, as long as those facilities were equal to the ones provided for white Americans. This policy became known as separate but equal. In reality, separate was almost never equal. Bathrooms for black Americans were smaller and dirtier than those for white Americans. Hospitals for black people were poorly staffed. Schools for black students were often overcrowded and lacking in basic supplies, like books. And white people were given the best seats on buses, in restaurants, and at the movies. During the 1950s, thousands of heroic Americans stood together to fight for civil rights, and many people bravely challenged separate but equal. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat on a bus for a white person. Several black families took their children's schools to court, demanding an end to segregation. And in 1960, 4 black college students from Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a lunch counter that was for white people only, and refused to move until they were served. These young men came to be known as the Greensboro Four, and what they were doing was called a sit-in, a protest in which people sit in one place until they get what they are asking for. The Greensboro Four sit-in forced the store to change their rule and allow black people to eat at the lunch counter. And their protest inspired other people across the country to fight for change. In the years that followed, the actions of these brave men and women helped secure passage of key civil rights legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, outlawed racial discrimination in education, in employment, and at public facilities. The following year, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which makes literacy tests and other obstacles to black voter registration illegal.
Okay, so that's what happened during the 1960s. But we're talking about the reform movements during the 1800s. Segregated New York. In 1854, the United States was close to the beginning of the Civil War, and the battle was largely fought over the issue of slavery. By 1804, laws had been passed to end slavery in the northern states. New York had outlawed it in 1799. However, many Southerners believed that slave labor was required for their way of life. They were ready to fight to keep it. In New York City, freedom had allowed a small but successful black middle class to grow. Its leaders encouraged self-improvement. They worked hard to prove themselves to be equal to whites. Among this community's most well-known members was Thomas Jennings. He was a successful tailor. Jennings was also the first African American to hold a U.S. patent. It was for an early method of dry cleaning clothes. His daughter Elizabeth was a teacher at a school that prepared young African Americans for higher education, and like her father, she was proud and independent. Still, being free didn't mean being equal. Black New Yorkers were second-class citizens, Harth says. Segregation was a way of life. Even successful blacks faced severe restrictions on where they could live, work, and mix with whites in public. But most of those restrictions were based on a custom rather than actual laws. The city's streetcar lines, also called railroads because they ran on tracks, were a good example. Conductors might allow a black person to board a car as long as no white riders complained. But conductors could refuse to let blacks ride, and they often did, making blacks wait for a car displaying the sign colored people allowed in the car. As a result, blacks often walk long distances rather than face that insult. On the morning of July 16th, 1854, Elizabeth Jennings and her friend Sarah Adams were running late to church. And as they stepped into the street, they waved down a Third Avenue streetcar that did not have a colored people sign. I want you to keep in mind that the term colored people was a phrase that was once used to describe African Americans. We do not use this anymore. Okay, it is considered out of date and very offensive to do so. So this is a term you'll hear for historical references. It is not a term that is used for modern times. Thrown out into the street. And from the start, there was trouble. As the women tried to board, the conductor stopped them. He told them that they should wait for another streetcar that had their people on it. Jennings refused to leave. After a tense standoff, the conductor said he would let them on if no one complained. This insulted Jennings. As she later recalled, I told him I was a respectable person, born and raised in New York, and that he was a good for nothing, meaning disrespectful, fellow for insulting decent persons while they're on their way to church. That did it. Oops. The conductor moved to push the women down into the street. Adams was pushed out, but Jennings put up a struggle on the car's platform. She held onto a window frame and then the conductor's coat. He called to the driver for help. The two men nearly succeeded in pushing Jennings off, but when the driver went back to his horses, Jennings broke free and boldly entered the car. The car continued on until the driver alerted a policeman. Without listening to her side of the story, Jennings later wrote, "The officer thrust me out and then pushed me." As she stood in the street, the officer told her to see if she could do anything about what he had done. Then she recalled, "He drove me away like a dog." A future president takes the case. At home, Jennings' father insisted that she write down what had happened to her. Then she showed her account to the leaders of the city's black community. They called an emergency meeting at a local church to decide on a plan of action. Word of Jennings' experience spread quickly. The New York Daily Tribune was an abolitionist newspaper run by the editor Horace Greeley. And by the way, just remember, an abolitionist, these are people that were opposed to slavery and wanted to get rid of it. The headline read, "Outrage upon colored persons." The news also appeared in other abolitionist papers. Jennings and her father decided to sue the Third Avenue Railroad Company. They hired an attorney named Chester A. Arthur to take the case. He was just 25 years old and fresh out of law school. Arthur later went on to become the 21st president of the United States. And so here you see a copy then of that New York Tribune, okay, with the title there, "Outrage Upon Colored Persons." Now let's take a look then at this quick video regarding Jennings' case, and then we'll get back with the rest of the article in a few moments.
There are some people who've been forgotten by history, like Elizabeth Jennings, one of the first African American women to stand up to segregation and win the right to equal treatment 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement. When a conductor throws Jennings off a horse-drawn omnibus, she pulls herself up and gets right back on.
I guess the conductor's turning around, maybe cleaning his hands off, saying, well, that's that. he turns around and she's on the bus, and he gets outraged.
Other riders are shocked when the conductor tells the driver not to stop until he comes to a policeman or police station.
So the policeman says, "Does anybody object to this woman being here?" Nobody said a word. But the policeman was on the conductor's side, and he starts pushing her with his billy club and saying, "Look, you shouldn't be on this bus. Get off. Don't give us any lip. Don't say anything to anybody about this." And they push her off. They throw her off again in the middle of nowhere.
Elizabeth is furious and not about to let them get away with such an injustice. She goes straight to her father, Thomas Jennings, who is a well-respected and shrewd African-American businessman.
Her father, Thomas Jennings, invented what we would consider dry cleaning today. It was dry scouring. He was the first African-American to receive a patent in 1821.
Thomas Jennings is a prominent abolitionist at this time, as is Frederick Douglass, who publishes the story. The incident garners national attention, and there's a huge public outcry. The Jennings family doesn't stop there. Along with a group of leaders in the black community, they hire a young, unknown attorney, a 24-year-old man named Chester A. Arthur, to file a lawsuit. It's his very first case. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Chester A. Arthur went on to become the 21st president of the United States.
Just like Lizzie, he came from an abolitionist background. So Arthur did believe in the cause. And then they go to trial 6 months later.
In February of 1855, the case goes before New York State's highest trial court, where Jennings finds herself face to face with an all-male, all-white jury.
Was there a defining moment in this trial, like a real turning point where things turned in their favor? Well, it's hard to say because there is no transcript of the trial that survived or that was taken.
It's probably a good reason why this story has been largely forgotten.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is nobody was paying attention because they didn't think she had any chance of winning. Like two sports teams where one is so overwhelmingly going to win, they say, why even bother keeping score? Well, it turns out they should have kept score.
Arthur, the politically gifted attorney and future president, delivers a convincing case. And remarkably, the verdict goes in Jennings' favor. Elizabeth is awarded $250, the equivalent of about $6,000 today. And the Third Avenue Railway Company is ordered to allow respectable black people to ride without discrimination.
Okay, so that was the case there with Elizabeth Jennings. And what happened, and amazingly, he was able to hire somebody that became a president in 1881 and a fellow abolitionist for that matter as well. The battle continues. As a result of the Jennings decision, the Third Avenue Railroad Company desegregated all of its cars, and most of the city's dozen or so other streetcar lines did the same. All the streetcar companies were independently owned. Some companies refused to change. More important, segregation itself was still not illegal. So even though she won her case, it didn't do anything to change the law. Okay, that would have to come much later. Thomas Jennings and other black leaders were determined to integrate all the streetcars. They organized a legal rights association. In churches, civic meetings, and newspapers, they called for blacks to keep entering the remaining segregated lines. If they were turned away, they were encouraged to sue. The LRA would cover their legal bills. To vote, this crusade sounds much like another fight for equality. That one changed Montgomery, Alabama, and the nation a century later. It's one of the earliest seeds of the civil rights movement. In 1864, 10 years after Jennings' stand and other legal battles, New York's last segregated streetcar line opened all of its cars to blacks. Segregation in public transportation in New York was formally outlawed by the state in 1873. So almost 20 years later, it finally became law. A tale nearly lost to history. And for years after the Jennings victory, blacks in New York City celebrated February 22nd. That was the date of the verdict. Jennings remained dedicated to improving life for African Americans. In 1895, she founded the city's first kindergarten for black children. But for the most part, history passed Elizabeth Jennings by. When she died in 1901, it was barely noticed outside the black press, and today her achievement is mentioned in a few studies of the fight for civil rights. Why? Well, for starters, her story was almost immediately overshadowed by the larger struggles of the Civil War. Says Harth, slavery was much more urgent issue than the rights of free blacks in the North. And also, Jennings didn't have the benefit of the modern media. Imagine if we were able to tweet out, right, these messages, put it on TikTok or something. But the 1950s and 60s images of peaceful protesters being beaten by police were shown in the newspapers and on TV throughout the country. The images showed Americans the ugly reality of discrimination. And Jennings' struggles may not be famous, however, it has a lot to teach us, historians say. Her fight for equality shows how far back the crusade for civil rights stretches. It was an important issue in the North as it was in the South. Her story helps Americans understand the full course of our history. So again, the not too well known, but it's starting to get out there now about Elizabeth Jennings and her fight for civil rights during this time of the reform movements of the 1800s, a whole century before the struggles of Rosa Parks. And that is the end of this article.